Hey friends, welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study. Trust that it's been a blessing to you. I know it's been a blessing on our side just to pour into the Word and share it with you all, and we trust that it's been a blessing on your end as well. So in this session, I'm going to jump back into Daniel chapter 8. I'm actually going to pick up and reiterate some of the things that I discussed in my last session. Ultimately, I ended by saying, look, there are two primary interpretations of Daniel 8. One is the traditional classic interpretation, and this is the interpretation, the position, by the way, that I articulate and I write about in my book, Mideast Beast, which I think I wrote that 2011, 2012. I think I wrote it 2011, published it in 2012. I think that sounds right. So the classic traditional interpretation, and when I say the classic traditional interpretation, I mean among futurist, conservative interpreters, dispensationalists, those that believe that Daniel is primarily, ultimately pointing to the end times, the return of Jesus, and much of it is yet future, right? So that interpretation essentially says that Daniel chapter 8, this vision of this two-horned ram and then this single-horned goat, and first the ram butts out into the Middle East, and then the goat comes and defeats the ram. But at the height of its power, the goat, the prominent horn, is broken off, and then four horns come up in its place. And then I know this is, again, very symbolic, strange language, but then out of one of these four horns comes the little horn, the arrogant little horn. And again, futurists essentially view this as the unfolding of history, okay, so this is historical, that you have the ram representing the Medo-Persian Empire that invaded the whole Middle East, and then it was followed by the rise, the consolidation and the rise of the Macedonian kingdoms up there in Ionia, in Greece, and Alexander III from Macedon. He comes and defeats the Medo-Persian Empire, right? And then as history says, as history notes, Alexander dies. The prominent horn is broken off, and in his place, four successors rise up. And out of one of these dynasties comes Antiochus Epiphanes. So in terms of Daniel chapter 8, in terms of the text, that part right there, that's really verses 2 through 8. But then in verses 9 through 12, it zeroes in on this little horn. And this is the part that most, again, conservative, futurist, often dispensationalist interpreters would view this as speaking of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Again, a very, very bad dude. But ultimately, he's a type, he's a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And there are clearly portions of the text that speak of the Antichrist, that speak in ways that cannot ultimately be applied to Antiochus. Okay, so again, this is the traditional classic interpretation, and that's the interpretation, again, that I take in my book, Mideast Beast. However, and interestingly enough, the first time that I ever taught this other interpretation, which I call the consistent futurist interpretation, the reason I call it consistent futurist is because it views all of the vision, verses 2 through 12, as all pertaining to the future. The first time that I ever actually taught this was when I was in northern Iraq. I was with Dalton, and we had gone to Kurdistan. Again, this was 5-6 months after ISIS. I guess 6 months. ISIS started, it exploded out of Syria in June of 2014. So in January of 2015, we made just a quick trip up there, sort of a scouting trip, to Kurdistan to work with the refugees, to do some medical relief and this type of thing. And when I was there, I had been wrestling through the consistent futurist interpretation of Daniel 8, and I sat down for the first time and I taught it. And again, I taught it very tentatively. Like, if this interpretation is correct, here's what we should expect to see. If this interpretation is correct. So it was very much, again, tentative and cautiously expressed. But the idea is this: if all of the prophecy concerns the future, then what we should expect to see is very specific. Very specific. It would mean the two-horned ram, i.e. Iran, is going to invade the whole Middle East. And again, this is 5 years ago, 2015. I said, let's watch. Let's see if Iran continues its expansion throughout the Middle East. Let's see if there's an invasion. Again, in many ways you can say, well, Iran has been invading the Middle East for a long time now, but they do so through proxies. They do so through puppet regimes like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, right? They do so through Hezbollah in Lebanon. They do so nowadays, well, they've been doing this really for the past 5 years since I taught this. They've been expanding into Iraq through the PMU, or the Hasht al-Shabi. They call it the Iran-backed militia, right? They're doing so in Afghanistan. They've done so down in Yemen with the Houthi rebels. They use junkyard dogs. They use proxies. They use puppets. And they've been expanding. They've been extending their spidery fingers throughout the whole region, like the puppet regime that they are. I mean, they're not a puppet regime; they're the puppet master regime, and they have a lot of puppets throughout the Middle East. So you can sit back and watch and go, well, the two-horned ram kind of is doing that, and so that fact sort of added credence to my conviction that perhaps this consistent futurist interpretation is accurate. And again, I've taught it quite a few times publicly, on YouTube at different prophecy conferences, and I've defended it, saying, look, this position really has some merit. I want to take some time to go through my various arguments that I presented, and then I want to explain why I no longer hold those positions, why I no longer hold that those arguments carry more merit than the traditional classic interpretation. So I'm going to argue against myself, and I trust that I will be kind to myself. I trust that I won't be too offensive. But again, so this is, just for clarity, the two primary interpretations, and I just want to explain why I have come back to the traditional interpretation. So there's really four main points that I brought up. There's really four main points to support the consistent futurist interpretation. And the first is the words of Gabriel, the words of Gabriel the archangel, in terms of what he says and what he articulates. Second is the issue of the word Yavan, which is translated as Greece. What is that referring to? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Third is the problem with the Diadochi. And again, I discussed a bit of this in the last session, but we're going to elaborate a little bit more again, because I want to express these various ideas or the problems, and again express why the traditional position has more merit, just concisely, so that it can be very clear in terms of why, again, I've come back to this traditional classic interpretation. And the fourth issue is the problem with the term the first king of Yavan. Again, Yavan being the Hebrew word that is often translated in all English translations as Greece. Okay, Yavan, sometimes people will say Javan, but really in the Hebrew it's Yavan, or sometimes Yawan, right? So when you go to Israel, you don't go to Tel Awi, you go to Tel Aviv. And so, of course, the joke is someone once asked this Hebrew professor, they said, so God's name, is it Yahweh or Yahweh? Is it Yehovah or is it Yehovah? And he said, based on all historic analysis and, all kinds of scholarship and so forth, it should be Yehovah or Yahweh. And everyone said, thank you very much. And he said, you're most welcome. Okay, so, look, there's, you can go either way is the point, but let's just say Yavan. Okay, we get that. Now, let's just jump into these different issues. So first of all, the words of Gabriel. This is the most important. So Daniel 8:15 through 16. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, again, the vision that's really laid out in verses 2 through 12, 13, 14. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was Gabriel the archangel. Okay, this is the messenger angel from the throne of God. And this was really, I think, the first thing that caused me to really begin questioning the traditional interpretation. And so one man says to Gabriel, not a man, he's actually an angel. One angel says to Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. So Gabriel came near to me where I was standing, and I was frightened, and I fell on my face, and he said, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end, to the end times. Okay, very clear, very emphatic, just very direct. Daniel falls into a deep sleep. Gabriel picks him up, verse 19. He said, behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation. This is a very specific phrase, by the way, which comes from Deuteronomy 32. It begins with the words of Moses, and he talks about the final period of indignation against the enemies of God. It's against the enemies of Israel and the enemies of God. And then it's a phrase that's repeated throughout Isaiah in particular. The final period of indignation. God is indignant with the nations because of the way they have treated his people. God actually identifies with his people, Israel. So this is the final period of indignation. It would have been understood. It's in the same way in modern times if we said, because it's about the apocalypse. This is a phrase that has become well known. I mean, we'll say things even outside of the biblical community. It was an apocalypse on Wall Street today, this type of thing. It was an Armageddon on Wall Street. Well, Wall Street collapses. That has nothing to do with a mountain in north central Israel called Har Megiddo, or this type of thing, right? But these terms, these phrases take on meaning, and they would be well understood. So again, Daniel would have understood the final period of the indignation. And again, he reiterates, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Again, Gabriel is emphatic 3 times. He states that the vision concerns the end times. And so again, when I looked at that, I go, Gabriel doesn't say verses 2 through 8 are historical and verses 9 through 12 are future. He doesn't say that. He just states the vision itself is about the end times. Now again, I've always qualified that the traditional classic interpretation, which again begins with history, but eventually arrives that it concludes with the end times, there's no problem with understanding Gabriel's words and still holding to that position. I've always said there's no problem with this idea that it bleeds from history, but the point is that Gabriel doesn't say that. He really doesn't. And so that's a valid point. I mean, it's something that, again, really caused me to question the classic interpretation. However, let's look at another verse, and this is in Daniel chapter 10. Now, we're going to get there. I'm going to address Daniel 10 later, and then Dalton's going to jump in and really hit 11 and 12, which is the culmination, in so many ways, of the prophecies of Daniel. But really, Daniel 10, 11, and 12 are all part of a very long, but one prophecy. In many ways, again, remember, the versification chapters in the Bible, they're not inspired, okay? They're not part of the inspiration of the Word of God. They're added much later, okay? So let's be very clear. Ultimately, Daniel 10, 11, and 12 should all be, in a sense, one chapter. They're all part of the same prophecy. That's important. Oftentimes, the chapterization, it follows the actual outline of different books, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the chapter breaks cause confusion, especially the chapter break between 11 and 12 causes a lot of confusion. Sometimes it's best just to ignore the chapter breaks and just read it, as the literature that it came to us. Okay, so chapter 10 is the introduction to the vision that is given in 11 and 12. But here in verse 14, again, Daniel is praying and he had been seeking the Lord and fasting. And this angel comes and he goes, Daniel, from the time that you sought to humble yourself and seek the Lord, I've been on my way. But behold, the principality, the prince of Persia, he stopped me. And I finally arrived. Again, we talked in the session on the Son of Man, the throne room, the courtroom, the divine council of how the fact is the scriptures describe God governs the cosmos using these divine beings, these heavenly beings, these assistants, these principalities. They're more than just angels. They're powerful beings. And here you have an example of an angel is coming from the throne of God, and he's stopped by another principality. It's crazy. I mean, it's a very strange thing to try to understand. We just go, well, God's sovereign. You know, an angel can just pop in and pop out, and he can, but it doesn't always work that way. There's conflict in the heavenlies. Okay, so, and again, we'll talk about this more, but Daniel is our prototype. He wants understanding into the Word of God. He doesn't just study it. He determines to humble himself, to fast, and to pray, and to set his heart and his mind in a position of receiving from the Lord. And this really is our pattern. If we want to be the people of understanding in the days ahead, we have to imitate Daniel, the man of understanding. And Daniel leaves us a beautiful, beautiful pattern. Again, we'll talk about that more. So the angel comes to Daniel in verse 14, again, chapter 10, verse 14. He says, "Now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future." Again, one sentence, two statements. First, he says the latter days. This is a very specific phrase in the Hebrew, ha'achrit hayomim. You'll see it throughout the scriptures. It ultimately means the last days. And you'll hear it used in rabbinic discussions and this type of thing, ha'achrit hayomim, ha'achrit. It literally means, it's like the hind quarters, the rump, the butt of the days, the end of the days. It doesn't always mean the last days in every single usage, but overwhelmingly it does. And then again, it reiterates, for it pertains to the days yet future, to the days in the distant future. So he makes this general statement. He says the vision is about, again, the latter days, the last days. Again, ha'achrit hayomim. And then it begins, let me just turn there. Again, we're going to come to this, so I don't want to jump in too much. But chapter 11 begins with the vision. He says, "Now I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia." Well, actually, let me jump back. The end of chapter 10, because this is fascinating. He says in verse 20, "So he said, 'Do you know why I have come to you? Soon I will return to fight against the prince of Persia.'" So he goes, I fought the prince of Persia. I came down. I'm giving you this. Now I'm going to have to go back, and I'm going to fight him again soon. Soon I'm going to fight, again, the principality of Persia. When I go, the prince of Greece will come. But it's basically saying soon the prince of Greece is coming. So he's actually prophesying that Persia and Greece are about to have this clash in the near future. Again, Greece being Yavon. We'll talk about that. And then he says, "But first I must tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one else supports me other than Michael, your prince." Michael is the principality over Israel, the protector of Israel. And then he says, "And in the first year," okay, so here it is, chapter 11, verse 1. "In the first year of Darius the Mede." So this is clearly rooted in history. He says, "I took my stand to support and protect him." So he says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, this angel is standing with Michael and warring in the heavenlies. And then he says, "Now I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise from Persia." So the point is, this is clearly rooted in history, in Daniel's history, in ancient history, Daniel's contemporary events with his life. Darius the Mede, 3 more kings will arise from Persia. That's not talking about our future. It's not talking about our time period. It's not talking about the last days, but he goes, I'm about to tell you what's going to happen in the latter days, in the ha'achrit hayomim, the last days, concerning the days yet in the distant future. But he begins with current times. And then as you follow chapter 11 through, and again, Dalton's going to go through much of this, it eventually arrives at the last days. It culminates with Antiochus Epiphanes, yea, Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes, a type, a foreshadow of the Antichrist. It eventually gets there. So here's the point. If Daniel 11 can begin with history and bleed into the last days, then there is no problem at all. We need to be honest. There's no problem at all. And I've always acknowledged this, but I just want to be clear. There is no interpretive problem with the words of Gabriel back in chapter 8, where he says over and over and again that the prophecy is about the last days. There's no problem with the interpretation, the traditional interpretation that says it begins with history and bleeds into the last days. Again, it got me. You know, I got caught there. I'm like, we have to be honest. Gabriel's words just say it's about the end times, the end times, the end times. Yes, it does. Elsewhere in the book of Daniel, we clearly do have the pattern that says there's no problem with it beginning in history, but leading to and arriving at the end times. There's no problem there. Okay. Now let's come back to this issue of Yavan, of Greece. Notice in chapter 10, verse 20, again, the angel speaking to Daniel. He says, do you understand why I've come? Again, we just read this. I will show you, I have to return to fight the prince of Persia, so I am going forth. This is the NASB. And behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. So here in Daniel chapter 10, the word there, Greece, same thing in Hebrew, Yavan. And unarguably, it's talking about Alexander the Great, historical Greece. Okay, so what I've basically said is I've said, look, if the prophecy is about the end times, there's no problem in Daniel chapter 8. When Gabriel explains, he says, the two-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia, but the goat comes from Yavan. The goat comes from the region of Yavan. Ionia, again, Western Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. This is the region of Macedonia. It expands over to the Greek islands, yes, but it also included the whole southwestern coastlands, the whole really western colony, if you will, of modern-day Turkey. That's the region that the goat came from. But my point was this. This is the point that I always made, is I said, look, if this is an end-time prophecy, there's no problem with these names, Media and Persia or Yavan, Greece, because this is how we always interpret prophecy. You look at, for example, Ezekiel 38:39, the battle of Gog-Magog. It uses very ancient names from the table of nations, Genesis 10. It uses Gog, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Cush, Put, Persia, right? It uses ancient names. We don't go, oh, well, therefore it must be a historical prophecy. We go, the context is clearly the end times, the day of the Lord, the culmination of redemption. Therefore, we say Ezekiel was using names that were understood in his day by him and his immediate audience. And then we try to determine where those places would have been understood and where do they correlate today. So Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, that essentially correlates to modern-day Turkey, the region of modern-day Turkey. And so we go, that's what Ezekiel was talking about, because it's an end-time prophecy, i.e. it's in our day is the actual context of its fulfillment. So I've said there's no problem, and this is true, there's no problem with doing that with Daniel 8. However, here's the point. Daniel 10, Yavan, is clearly used of Alexander's Greek Empire. In Daniel 10 and 11, when it begins by talking about Darius the Mede, and then these other Persian kings that come after him, and then a powerful king from Greece, from Yavan, that follows, that is clearly Alexander the Great. There's really almost no one that will try to make all of chapter 11 future. There's probably a few interpreters out there, but it doesn't work. It clearly begins rooted in ancient history, and it doesn't just suddenly jump out of the blue, without any indicator. You can't say, well, the first couple of kings here are ancient history, but the next verse suddenly is, the distant future without any indicator within the text. That just doesn't work. Okay, so clearly here you have Alexander the Great and his empire referred to as Yavan. So again, there's no problem back in Daniel chapter 8 with seeing that as Greece as well. In fact, I think that's the best interpretation. Again, back in chapter 7, with the four gruesome beasts, you've got the lion, you've got the bear, you've got the leopard, right? The leopard, again, Greece. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. And by taking the traditional interpretation, what it does is it causes all of the visions and prophecies of Daniel to really flow together much nicer. Much nicer. Daniel 2 begins by introducing these various kingdoms in the Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the metallic statue. Daniel 7 reiterates. It now uses the symbolism of beasts, but it really zeroes in particular, on the fourth beast, and especially on the little horn. So it takes the prophecy of Daniel 2 and it expands it, but it's essentially reiterating the same thing, but it focuses in on the little horn. Okay, Daniel 8, again, does the same thing. It in particular really zeroes in on the Antichrist, the little horn, and then later, which again we'll get to, Dalton will hit on in chapter 11, it really gives us incredible details concerning the actual battles and the things that will take place with the Antichrist, with the little horn. Very, very detailed prophecy. Again, always culminating with the return of Jesus, the establishment of his kingdom, the end of these corrupt, wicked, pagan, Gentile aggressors. Okay, so again, it causes the book of Daniel all to flow together much more nicely, rather than saying, well, one prophecy is historical and another one's just the end. It's a progressive unfolding revelation that flows really quite nicely. Okay, again, stepping forward in Daniel chapter 11, we've already read it. It says, behold, 3 more kings will arise from Persia, then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. Again, tying them all into one another, tying them back to Darius the Mede. And as soon as this fourth one becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Yavon, against Greece. That's exactly what happened. And essentially, again, history is challenging, it's complicated, and I'm not a historian. But essentially, Medo-Persia conquered the whole Middle East, again, coming from the region of Iran, sweeping across the whole Middle East, and then up there in Macedonia, Ionia, again, Western Asia Minor, Turkey, modern-day Greece. That whole area, you had these various city-states that had been developing, but they were a province. It was the Macedonian province of Medo-Persia. And then they started to rebel. And so that's what it's talking about here. It will stir up everyone against the Greeks, against this little upstart rebellious province. But then what happens is Alexander's father emerges, again, out of these various city-states. Sparta, Athens, Macedonia, there's a handful of them, right? And then they kind of consolidate, and Alexander rises up, and then he defeats the entire empire. He defeats the entire empire, and that's exactly what Daniel 11 explains. And again, it uses the term Yavon. It's the same term used back in Daniel 8. So it's really, let's just say again, it's much more simple to understand that Daniel is talking about the same thing in chapter 8 that he's talking about in chapter 10 and 11. That it's not one thing in chapter 10 and 11 and something completely different in chapter 8. It's much easier to understand that everything is flowing together. Okay, and then I discussed this last week, again, the problem with the Diadochi. The Diadochi are the successors. After Alexander died, after the prominent horn was broken off, 4 successors rose up in his place. This was the biggest issue that bothered me. And again, just grab these as I said, I did due diligence. I did the homework. I worked through Greek history. But again, history, it's a very complicated period of history is murky anyway. History is complicated anyway. But this particular time period, it's like you just start out reading it. You've got all of these names. You've got Perdiccas, and then you've got Eumenes, like I can't even pronounce half of them. Imminence. You've got all these different names, and you're working through this very complicated period of history and trying to weed through it. But one thing emerged. One thing that from my whole sort of wishy-washy back and forth did emerge is this. The vast majority of Christian commentaries majorly oversimplify that period and really kind of get it wrong. They really do. And I'm not saying that arrogantly, but there's an oversimplification of that time period. I'll read this statement. I don't know if I read this in the last session. This is a statement from John Walford, again, former dean of Dallas Theological Seminary, great theologian, dispensationalist, but in his commentary on Daniel, he says this: practically all commentators, now notice again, his words, not mine, practically all commentators, however, recognize the four horns as symbolic of the four kingdoms of the Diadochi, which emerged as follows. Number one, Cassander assumed rule over Macedonia and Greece. 2, Lysimachus took control of Thrace, Bithynia, and most of Asia Minor. Seleucus took Syria and the lands to the east, including Babylonia. Ptolemy established rule over Egypt, possibly Palestine and Arabia Petraea. Again, that's John Walford. Now, that is, again, a dramatic oversimplification. Now, he is right in that practically all modern dispensationalist futurist commentators do say that. But again, when you go back to the earliest commentaries that we have on the book of Daniel, the very first one that we have in our possession is written by Hippolyta, again, just at the very beginning of the 4th century, the late 3rd, beginning of the 4th century. He wrote a commentary on Daniel, and he identifies the four horns, again, that came after Alexander, as Seleucus, Demetrius, Ptolemy, and Philip. So he has two names that he agrees with Walford, two that he doesn't. Philip, Demetrius, completely not part of Walford's list. 50 years later, Ephraim the Syrian, he has the exact same list as Hippolyta. The same year, however, Eusebius, the church historian, he lists Seleucus, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Philip. So instead of Demetrius, he has Antigonus. About 52 years later, Jerome, the Latin father, he agrees with Eusebius. And then about 23 years later, Theodoret of Cyrus from Syria, he lists Seleucus, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Antipater. Okay, so what's amazing is you've got three lists here in the first 500 years, the first 5 examples that we have in ancient Christian history, again, after the apostles, but really the first 430 years, 400 years, really, 400 years after Christ, we've got 3 different delineations of who the four are, and they all disagree with Walford. So what happens, and guys, this is just so common, and it's common in scholarship, but it's just as common in Christian scholarship and writing commentaries, is we learn how to ape our teachers. We learn how to parrot and reflect our teachers. Someone goes to Dallas Theological Seminary, they learn from John Walford, and then they eventually write their own commentary, and they just imitate the teachers before them. And you don't have a lot of folks that do the hard homework and go back to the, again, Hippolytus and Jerome and, on and on and on, and then go, wait a minute, is Walford's statement accurate? And it's really not. It's not that there were 4 clear successors. However, anyway, so let me just say that bothered me, and rightfully so, because when you really do work through that period, there were not 4 main divisions. There were 5. There were 5. And I would say, if you're to, again, overly simplify that period, I would agree with Walford. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Antigonus. Again, I talked about him a little bit last time. Antigonus Monophthalmus, Antigonus the one-eyed, the greatest of all the successors. But again, that bothered me in that there were 5, and my reasoning was this. I said, if the Bible says there's 4, it needs to be 4. and history says there was 5. Now again, this is where I really began, but I was saying maybe I'm reading history wrong. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. So not until I got this book, which was the last of the 5, the books that I've worked through, this one, which just came out fairly recently, Antipater's dynasty, Alexander the Great's regent and his successors. So I'm going to read just the preface to this book, and this is where I went, okay, maybe I am reading it wrong. Maybe I am reading it wrong. There's about a paragraph here. This is the introduction. He says, in the aftermath of Alexander's destruction of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, during the campaigns of 334 to 323, Alexander died in 323, 4 families emerged to found dynasties who ruled sections of that empire. So I go, whoa. So here's a historian. He goes, after Alexander died, 4 families emerged. He says, the best known because of the proliferation of sources available for studying it. In other words, we have a lot of information about this. The first and best known is Ptolemy, the dynasty of Ptolemy. The greatest of the dynasties was that came from Seleucus. Okay, so that would be the Seleucid. He says he was a friend. This is interesting. He was a friend, a colleague, and an enemy of Ptolemy. He was a frenemy colleague, which ruled varying territories from Asia to the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. And then he says, from the family of Antigonus, again, monophthalmus, began the process of assuming royal titles after an erratic early career, came to rule Macedon. So basically what he's saying is there's this family of Antigonus that split. It basically declared itself to have royal blood. And then he says the least known and the shortest of all of these came from Antipater. Again, Antipater, the Antipatrid. And so as I looked at this, I go, okay, so maybe my reading of this period of history that there were 5, that's accurate, but maybe there is a way, again, from heaven's perspective to say after Alexander died, there were 4. Because again, I don't believe we need to shoehorn. We don't need to defend the Bible. We don't need to save God, right? If the Bible, look, history is going to confirm the Bible. And this has really been the issue for me. And I know it's weird that studying history becomes a big part of it. But I looked at it and I said there were 5 successors. What I'm now coming to understand is that there were 4 families. And Antigonus, who really was the greatest of all of these guys, he split. That Seleucus and Antigonus came from the same family. And then you had the Antipatrid, and this is where it gets murky and confusing. And out of the Antipatrid dynasty, you had all of these daughters that intermarried into the other dynasties. And that's where, seeing this nice, clean 4 horns emerge becomes challenging. But again, from the perspective of heaven, after Alexander died, it broke up into 4. This is the point, is there's not a problem with history. It's just that is the way that heaven has determined to define that period of history. And again, we looked at some of the verses later, but again, let's just reiterate these. In Daniel chapter 7, and this is what we began the Maranatha Bible study by I acknowledged at the end of chapter 7 going, I know that I'm about to get to Daniel 8, and I'm going to tell you that I have a problem with saying that there were 4 successors. I have a problem there, so I have a problem back here in chapter 7 as well, saying I don't know how to explain that the leopard, i.e. Greece, has 4 heads and 4 wings. Because I know that in a few sessions I'm going to tell you, after Alexander died, there were not 4. There were 5, right? However, again, just following Daniel's pattern, fasting and praying and reading the Bible and history, I've come to say, something, I don't think there's a problem with that. I think, again, that is the way that heaven is determined. And that is what we find consistently throughout Daniel. So in Daniel 7, after this I kept looking, behold, a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast had 4 heads. Again, what is that referring to? It's referring to Alexander's empire after he died, the 4 families that emerged out of it, that fought the dynasties let's just say the 4 dynasties that fought to regain control of Alexander's empire. There were 4. That's how the Bible defines it. That's how God determined to define that period. Daniel 8, verse 8, then the male goat, okay, the goat, magnified itself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. It uses that very specific phrase, toward the 4 winds of heaven. Again, later in chapter 11, which again we'll get to, verses 3 through 4, it says, and a mighty king will arise. But again, that statement in chapter 11 is tied into history. We've already looked at it. In chapter 10, transitioning into 11, the angel clearly ties it into Darius the Mede, and then 4 more kings from Persia, and then this mighty king. That's Alexander the Great. History is clear. And he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. That language, do as he pleases, that's the same language used back there for the goat with the prominent horn back in chapter 8. But as soon as he had arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. Again, the exact same language used back in chapter 8. Identical language. It's a problem when you have something so clearly intended to remind us of a previous statement and then say, no, those 2 things are completely different. Right? I complained about some of these guys that say the little horn in chapter 7 and the little horn in chapter 8 are 2 totally different individuals. I go, no, guys, come on. It's clearly intended to conjure up memories and remind us of the same thing. It's talking about the same thing. Okay? Oh, and then finally, let me touch on this, is the other problem I had is I said, look, it says that the prominent horn on the goat is the first king of Yavon. And I go, guys, Alexander the Great was like, I don't remember exactly, it's like he's like the 23rd king or the 30th king of Macedonia. He's not the first king. The point is this, Alexander, and I've always allowed for this, I've never made this a big deal. Alexander was the first king to arise, consolidate all of the various city-states that comprised what we call Greece in the ancient Greece, and then eventually, again, came to conquer all of Medo-Persia. He was the first greatest king to really emerge out of this whole period and establish himself and really put Greece on the map as an empire. He's the first one, and so that's not a problem. Again, I just did not want to be guilty of trying to shoehorn history in to conform to my perspective, but ultimately that you don't have to shoehorn it in. It really does work. Okay, so ultimately that's a summary of all of the reasons that I used to hold to in terms of defending the consistent futurist perspective, and why, upon further consideration, I've come to the place where, say, ultimately the traditional classic interpretation, I think, has more merit. Okay, now I want to end this by talking about implications. One of the reasons that the consistent futurist interpretation grabbed me, because I said, if this is the case, again, if this is the case, it gives us a very, very clear roadmap in terms of the next series of events that we should expect to see unfold in the Middle East before the Antichrist arises. This invasion of Iran, followed by a Turkish response, followed by that breaking up into 4, out of which comes the Antichrist. And I went, that's a real specific thing. A specific series of events that we can watch for. And so if that were the case, then yeah, we should pay attention. However, again, now coming to the place where I say, now look, does that mean that Iran will not invade the Middle East? I'm sure that could happen. That could happen. Maybe ancient history is a faint reflection ultimately. Maybe all of the prophecy is a reflection of what's to come. But again, I think the primary context, the primary meaning of chapter 8 is not an end-time prophecy. Its primary context is history that bleeds into the last days. Okay, so if that's the case, which again, I really do feel confident at this point. I won't keep going back and forth, I promise. Then what that means is this, and this is the pastoral, practical ramifications, is that the coming forth of the Antichrist could happen much sooner than these drawn-out scenarios. It could happen rather quickly. And this is something that we need to be prepared for. Now listen, there's a tension. There's a tension for any of us that study biblical prophecy between, the term is often used with regard to the rapture and the return of Jesus. Dispensationalists that believe in the pre-tribulational rapture, they'll say the return of Jesus is imminent. And imminence, the doctrine of imminence, becomes the primary basis oftentimes for the pre-tribulational rapture. They'll argue that there are scriptures that say that Jesus can return at any time, and therefore pre-tribulational rapture. It could happen right now. It could happen now. At any second, it could happen. Okay. I don't believe in that kind of imminence. I believe that the Bible does teach imminence in this sense. At any given time, it could come upon us as if suddenly. Right now, I'm teaching here, we're in the middle of the coronavirus. It came upon us suddenly. It came upon us rapidly. In a period of just a couple months, we were locked down in our houses. We're stepping back going, this is nothing. It's just like the flu, to suddenly going, it is killing people. Now, granted, in retrospect, we may say it's not much worse than the flu, but the point is we recognize that something big was coming, and it had the potential, at least initially, to kill millions of people. And again, we still don't even know at the time of this recording where it's going to end. But the point is these type of catastrophes come on quickly. And the series of events that will lead to the return of Jesus, they can come quickly. Now, again, I don't believe in imminence because, for example, there are events in biblical prophecy that need to take place. No one will argue that the scriptures clearly say that Israel would have to be in the land, repatriate the land before the return of Jesus. Before the reestablishment of the state of Israel, you couldn't say that Jesus is going to return at any second because there are events that need to take place. And those things don't happen overnight, right? But when it comes to these issues of the Antichrist, it's something that could happen quite quickly. We could find ourselves in that final period of testing very, very quickly. And that's the pastoral, that's the issue of urgency that permeates the prophetic scriptures. That's why when Jesus says, repent for the day of the Lord is at hand, it's so popularly understood, interpreted or claimed that he was saying, there's a new era. The kingdom is so close you can reach out and touch it and access it. That's not what Jesus was saying. He was simply saying the same thing that Zephaniah, that Joel, that Isaiah were saying. Weep, wail, mourn, repent, because the day of the Lord it's pressing, it's urgent, it's coming quickly. Whether we face the day of judgment because we die, and then it's as though then we're standing before the judgment seat of Christ, or because we live to the day when we are caught up and we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, right? That day is coming. Regardless, it's coming. And so the issue there is of urgency. Now, again, here's the tension, is that on one hand, the Lord wants us to live with this daily sense of urgency, that in any day we could die, and any day we could be facing our antichrists, plural, and there's plenty of antichrists out there, or we could face the Antichrist. We could face our day of trial and tribulation, or we could face the great tribulation that will come upon the whole earth, right? On the other hand, and here's the tension, the Lord also wants us to be long-term planners. He doesn't want us to say, I'm not going to bother getting my tooth fixed, or I'm not going to get that surgery because Jesus is going to return imminently, any day now. You go, they've been saying that for a long time. Get the surgery. Send your kids to college. Get the PhD. Plan on living a full life. Plan on your kids living a full life. On the other hand, live with the idea, the possibility, live with that sense of urgency that the kingdom could be established and here on earth in a very quick number of years. The tribulation could be here any day. So there's a tension there. But ultimately, with regard to Daniel chapter 8, this idea that the Antichrist could be here soon, I think that gives us fuel to live with that biblical sense of urgency. And so in a lot of ways, that's the takeaway message. Now, in terms of the details, We're going to get there. Again, Dalton's going to cover that when we get to Daniel chapter 11. There are details. There are things that need to unfold first that we can pay attention to, that we can be looking for, specifics. But even if we don't have clarity on the specifics, we need to be living with a sense of urgency. We need to be ready today and tomorrow. So amen and amen. I do trust that was helpful. Look forward to seeing you for the next session. Until then, God bless you guys. Maranatha.